Mozart, his symphonies would come into his head. But if you believe in precognition, you should be able to see your future work, be it a poem or a piece of music. You think you're creating this, but actually you're hearing yourself, you're plagiarizing yourself in the future. Yeah. So the question is that telling you something subtle about the nature of creativity and genius?
Is the idea of getting information out of the future somehow compatible with physics? And if yes, how? It is questions like these that I touch upon in this conversation with Professor Bernard Carr and philosopher Bernardo Kastrup.
The answer to the mystery of the human mind at least overlaps substantially, if it isn't the same, as the answer to the mystery of the nature of time. The ticking of clocks is a content of perception, and that is itself a mental thing. We just quantify that, and therefore we can attach some degree of objectivity to the number of ticks of the clock. But we are still talking about experience in both cases.
All of space-time exists as one sheet, like this table, which includes the past, present, and maybe the future, but at least a possible future. And you can imagine that the higher you go, the more you can see of this landscape, of this four-dimensional landscape.
The movie Interstellar by Christopher Nolan nicely visualizes the fifth dimension. In this higher dimension, the main character Cooper can overview his whole life as these four-dimensional cubes. Now, from this perspective, what can we say about the passage of time?
So from the point of view of Bernardo Kastrup, there is a flow of time. But Bernardo Kastrup didn't stay the same. This thing we call Bernardo Kastrup changed with it. So if the reference point is changing with the changes around it, then you're just going over the track on the CD.
Once you see your entire timeline, you are always being born. You're always dying. You're always in school. These things are always happening, and you just access them at will.
It feels sort of zen or a bit cliche to say that in this higher dimension there's only the now. And only the now exists is something you hear very often. But Professor Bernard Carr points to the fact that we have to be a bit more precise when we talk about the now.
One of the features of these extra time dimensions is that what we call now is bigger. So when you say that we are only aware of now, you have to say, which now do you mean? Do you mean the now in this short specious present, or do you mean the now with the bigger specious present?
The now we as humans experience lasts about 1/10 of a second. Now, what if there's a higher time dimension with a specious presence, a now, of 14 billion years? That would mean that in such a higher dimension, a clock wouldn't have made one click since the Big Bang. And this is where things get mind-boggling when you think about consciousness, and especially about self-ego consciousness.
We don't seem to experience the identity between us. No, Bernardo isn't Hans. Hans isn't Bernardo.
There's no way consciousness can do that if we have a one-dimensional time.
We cannot account for why you are not. We cannot account for how you can be me while being yourself at the same time. We cannot account for that without the model of multidimensional time, without these extra degrees of freedom.
Identity, the separation and separate identity only works on a narrow range of space or time scales.
Thanks so much for watching. I'm sitting here with philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, director of the Essentia Foundation, and Professor Bernard Carr. And Professor Bernard Carr has just hosted a conference for the Essentia Foundation called Time and Mind. And this one is really exciting because it brings together two topics that usually are discussed in the fields of philosophy and physics, but not so often that philosophers and physicists and neuroscientists meet to discuss the relationship between time and mind. And before I share my thoughts, Professor Bernard, very welcome. Great that you did this conference for us. you were asked by Bernardo to do this, and you were then given the freedom to invite the scientists you find interesting to discuss this with, right?
Indeed, yes. And I of course, am fascinated in the problem of time and mind. And so I know quite a lot of people who work in those areas, but I deliberately selected people who could talk about the overlap of those areas. I mean, there are many physicists who have written books about time, and these are great books about time, but they don't refer to mind or consciousness.
Yeah.
And of course, there are many philosophers who have written books about mind. And I should say, even within philosophy, the group of philosophers who study mind tend to be distinct from the group of philosophers who study time, which is a bit weird. So it's not just the distinction between the physicists and the philosophers. I mean, even within the philosophers themselves, there's a bit of a difference. So, I mean, at this meeting, we really only had one philosopher, and then, well, she was even a historian of philosophy. So I suppose most of the people, I mean, the majority of the speakers were physicists, and that's because I'm a physicist and I obviously have a tendency to know the people in physics, but we did also have representatives of the fields of psychology and neuroscience, and one philosopher. So it wasn't a perfect balance between those different areas, but I thought it's probably the sort of balance we need, because...
And you managed to arrange some great, like very renowned physicists. For instance, we had Paul Davies, George Ellis, Lee Smolin, and philosophers Jimena Canales, Jonathan Schooler, neurophysicist Alex Gomez Marin, and cognitive neuroscientist Julia Mossbridge, and psychologist Marc Wittman. And so we will discuss in this video we will give you an overview of what these speakers, what their take is on the relationship between time and mind from their different perspectives. But first, also nice to mention, because I haven't given you a proper introduction yet, that you are a professor of mathematics and astronomy at Queen Mary University London, and you studied under Stephen Hawking. You even featured in a film about Stephen Hawking. The two of you were friends. You've written a book, Multiverse or Universe? Or
Multiverse or Universe.
Exactly. And what not many people know is that you've always been fascinated by phenomena at the edge, so to speak, of mind, parapsychological phenomena, and you also gave a presentation during this conference about that. And I think it's just beautiful that you now were able to bring this together, right? Because it also has been these two themes in your career to now bring this together in one conference.
I suppose in a way what I was doing in the conference, I was bringing together these different elements which are already inside me and in some sense, I suppose, present a sort of conflict with inside me. I've always been interested in not only in physics, which of course is in a sense my first love. That's how I made my money. That's been my professional career, if you like. I'm a cosmologist, to be more precise, and I sort of study problems like the dark matter problem and dark energy, gravitational waves, black holes, multiverse, things like that. Those are problems in what's a speculative but respectable domain of science. But besides that, I've always been interested in also consciousness, but more specifically those phenomena associated with consciousness which go beyond the normal experience. I mean, even understanding normal consciousness is an enormously interesting problem. Philosophers spend their life doing that. But I'm also interested in what you might describe as anomalous mental phenomena. Some people use the word paranormal phenomena, although that gets one into trouble. But so if you like, you've got the normal, the paranormal, and the transpersonal, which goes beyond that. The transpersonal is, if you like, spiritual type of experiences. So I've always been interested in those three worlds. I say the worlds of matter, mind, and spirit. And of course, my publications tend to be in the world of science, and so that's probably where I'm most well known and most respectable. But I've always been equally interested in the other worlds. And I'm interested, for example, in psychical research. And I'm interested in psychical research because to me, it provides a bridge between science and, if you like, mysticism. These words like spirituality and mysticism make people uncomfortable, but in some sense, that's why I'm interested in psychical research. It provides this bridge.
Yeah.
And probably, in terms of my other activities, I've spent most time in psychical research outside my professional field because I've just been involved in it for many years, and I've been involved in the Society for Psychical Research. But it's interesting, psychical research is a rather awkward position. By and large, the scientists don't like it because it seems too mystical. They don't believe the phenomena. But even the mystics often don't like it because it's too scientific. So it's a rather uncomfortable position. You get attacked by both sides. But nevertheless, that always happens when you're trying to bridge different disciplines. There's always opposition towards it. But I think it's important because I think progress is normally when you do get a more unified view of the universe from bridging different disciplines. I mean, that applies even within science. But here I'm talking about science and
but what I find interesting is that from a physics perspective, I sense a lot of openness. Now, of course, you brought physicists that you know, and you probably knew that they would be open to this, but because, and that was new to me, that a lot of these phenomena are, in a sense, compatible with an Einsteinian worldview of a block universe, which I would like to dive into a bit deeper. So I really think this is also the moment in time to bring these two worlds together, right?
Well, first of all, let me say that in my own view, it isn't compatible with Einstein's block universe, because my own view is that you can't even accommodate consciousness within Einstein's four-dimensional space-time. And in particular, you certainly can't accommodate it within the block universe.
Yeah.
So, and I have my own model, which we may talk about later, which says you've got an extra dimension. But regardless of the technicalities, physicists say these phenomena can't be real because they're not compatible with physics. And therefore they say, I don't need to look at the data. It can't be right because it's not incompatible with physics. And to me, that's a nonsense attitude because we don't know what the final picture of physics is. We're looking for it. These phenomena may not be compatible with relativity. As I said, consciousness can't even be described by relativity. They might seem to be more compatible with quantum theory, but I don't think quantum theory can provide an explanation. And by and large, quantum physicists get rather annoyed when people start saying their theory can be used to explain speculative experiences like telepathy. But so I agree that these phenomena can't be described in terms of relativity and quantum theory, but the whole point is we know there's going to be a final theory of physics, or at least a next theory of physics, which is going to marry these two together. Yeah. And so to me, that's where if consciousness is going to come into physics, that's where it will come in. And no one is in a position to say your final theory of physics cannot possibly contain consciousness. So that's why I disagree with physicists who, from a theoretical perspective, say these phenomena can't be real. I think they are real, some of them at least, and because I think they're real, I feel it's important to expand physics because I also have a lot of faith in physics.
Exactly, and we don't even need to go to these sort of edge phenomena of parapsychology because first the big challenge is to incorporate consciousness.
Absolutely,
right? And,
even describing normal mind is a
big,
huge challenge, and of course it's a challenge philosophers and been thinking about hundreds of years. But I mean, but what I would say is, if we are going to have a theory of mind, a theory of physics which accommodates mind, it has, of course, to explain normal phenomena. But I would say it also has to explain these other phenomena, these paranormal phenomena, and maybe even the transpersonal phenomena. I mean, not everyone would agree with that. I mean, some people might believe in psychic phenomena, but not mystical phenomena. But you've got to try. You've got to try and expand physics. And maybe it won't be successful. I mean, most physicists probably don't share that dream. But I just think you have to try and try and expand physics. Because the whole history of physics has been one of conservative physicists saying, oh no, that's outside the domain of science. It might be true, it might be interesting, but it's not part of science.
Someone said today that when you just present someone with an empirical data and your answer is, does it fit my theory? Exactly. As a question, which is sort of the weird question
exactly,
to ask.
But that's really what
but that is in a way
that's what these skeptics are saying. They're saying this doesn't fit my theory, but they don't have the right theory yet.
Yeah. Okay.
But there was another point, because you started off by saying that most physicists were open to these things. I don't think that's quite true. I mean, even at the meeting, I would imagine at least a couple of the physicists were rather skeptical of some of these phenomena. So, I mean, you may have noticed that at the meeting, I was a little bit coy in talking about parapsychology and some of these more exotic phenomena, partly because of who was speaking, but also because I didn't know who was in the audience. Because, if I'm giving a talk to the public, I'm happy to talk about these things. But if I'm giving a talk to the physics colloquium, I wouldn't talk about things like that because there would be a prejudice against it. Now, I've not done a survey to find out what fraction of physicists take these phenomena seriously. But all I know is quite a lot of very eminent physicists reject them out of hand. I mean, my own Stephen Hawking, my supervisor and my friend, for whom I had tremendous admiration, I'm sure he doesn't believe in these phenomena. He actually he read the books of J.B. Ryan when he was a teenager and decided the whole field was nonsense. but I mean, that's fine if he wants to have that view. I've never felt any desire to persuade my physics colleagues that they should actually get interested in paranormal phenomena, because science is very narrow. You only succeed in science by focusing on a very narrow area. And so I could say to my physics friends, well, look, you should read 100 years of literature of psychical research or do some experiments, take ayahuasca or something, and then you would change your mind. But why? How can I expect them to do that? Because studying black holes or dark matter, whatever it is, it's a full-time occupation. So I've never resented physicists who just aren't interested in these phenomena. I only get annoyed when people don't look at the evidence, know nothing about the subject, and say it must be rubbish.
Don't want to look through the lens,
They don't want to look, we say we don't want to look through the telescope.
That's it.
After Galileo. So So I would think most of my, there's three groups. Most of my physics friends probably just haven't had the experience and aren't sufficiently interested to actually look at the data. That's fine. Some of them vehemently believe the phenomena can't be real, simply because they claim that they're incompatible with physics. They're the ones I disagree with. And there's another relatively small fraction of physicists like me who believe in these phenomena and also want to expand physics. I mean, there are lots of people who believe in the phenomena, but I'm talking about the physicists who believe in the phenomena. And that's probably a small number, because by and large, only a small number of people have had these experiences. People who are interested in these experiences, I mean psychical or mystical experiences, they want to explain them. And that's why they want to explain them in terms they're used to. So as a physicist, I want to explain them in terms of physics.
Check.
Most of my physics friends haven't had these experiences, and therefore they're not interested in expanding physics, and that is fine.
Let's move on to the topic of time, because I think people are now used to sort of the fact, at least our audience, that physics is encountering consciousness and tries to incorporate it, or at least some physicists try to do that. But what I really liked about this conference is that it also involves time. And of course, we know that time has a very strong position in physics. Every physicist knows what time is, but we have a problem when it comes to the passage of time, the flow of time. And now I want to move a bit on to engage you in this conversation, Bernardo, because you have a very proper understanding of physics and philosophy. And it seems to me also like this gap between the subjective understanding of time, what philosophers talk about a lot, and objective time. And then I mean sort of the stuff a lot was mentioned. I like that sort of definition that what a physicist would say, time is what a clock measures, right? Sort of what we call objective time. So can you tell a little bit about how you see that gap, or isn't there a gap between subjective time and objective time? How we experience it and how we talk about it in physics?
I think operationally it is useful to make the distinction between objective time and subjective time. Subjective time is malleable. If you're interested in activity, it feels like time passes fast. If you're bored, it feels like time passes slow. But if you count the number of clock ticks, it's the same in both cases if it's the same amount of time. So it's operationally useful. But the more in-depth conceptual, metaphysical distinction between these two kinds of time, I don't think that is absolutely clear yet, unless we define objective time as what clocks measure.
Do you agree with that definition?
I think it's operationally useful, but of course it doesn't go deep enough into what we mean by time.
You still don't know what you're measuring.
and therefore, we still don't quite understand what the relationship is between objective time and subjective time. The ticking of clocks is a content of perception, and that is itself a mental thing. We just quantify that, and therefore we can attach some degree of objectivity to the number of ticks of the clock. But we are still talking about experience in both cases. We experience clocks ticking, we experience the counting of clock ticks, and we experience the subjective flow of time. So the relationship between the two is not too clear. Where my greatest interest is, however, is not in the relationship between subjective time and objective time. It's the relationship between the nature of the human mind and the nature of time.
Yeah.
Because I think the answer to the mystery of the human mind at least overlaps substantially, if it isn't the same, as the answer to the mystery of the nature of time. And there is where I think that the most promising developments are going to come.
Because to me, that's really intuition. My consciousness seems fully dependent on time, because I can only imagine being conscious or experience the world if there is a now in which stuff happens, if there is a past, a present, and a future. And it's like now, and I just cannot imagine being conscious without time. So to me, so curious what your thoughts are here, Carr, and also please discuss this, but do you agree there? I mean, do you think the two are intertwined and need each other? Or?
I have quite a strong view. I think that subjective time, mental time, is different from physical time. And in my model, one is T1 and the other is T2. It's a different dimension. And it's the conscious time which is the most fundamental. But when you perceive the physical world through your physical sensory systems, through your brain, through the filter of the brain, then you're perceiving what we call objective time. So it's rather like you're in a room and you're looking through a window, and in that window you see the physical world. And so it's all, in some sense, the primary time is your mental time in my perception, but the physical time is how that relates to the outside world. So that's the objective time. But the point is, most physicists don't even acknowledge the existence of subjective time. Psychologists do, but most physicists, well, they can say they're not interested in it because they think that all that matters is objective time. Objective time is the third person. You know, physics is concerned with the third person description of the world, and that's where the objective clocks are and things. But the first person perspective, that is what relates to subjective time. And in the normal space-time of relativity theory, I said before, there is no passage of time, there is no consciousness, there is no mental time. It is an extra dimension in my way of looking at things. And I'm not quite sure whether Bernardo will agree with that, but I think that is fundamental. And I would say there is something missing fundamentally from physics until they acknowledge that there is this extra time. So, for example, you have people saying, what's the speed of time? what a stupid question. It's 1 second per 1 second. Well, to me, that's a stupid answer, because it's nothing to do with that. When we talk about the speed of time, we're talking about the relationship between mental time and physical time. How much mental experience you seem to have for a given amount of external objective time. And that varies tremendously. We had talks in the meeting. I mean, Marc Wittman spoke about this, how your subjective time can change, well, your subjective flow of time, which means subjective time versus objective time, how can that can vary dramatically. So they are different, and it's nothing to do with 1 second per 1 second. It's to do with mental time versus physical time.
And if the two of you can reflect on what Bernardo just said, the mystery between time and mind and the relationship between those two. So I already said my intuition that they need each other, and you cannot have consciousness without time. At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
Do you agree with me, or?
You cannot. I mean, consciousness, whatever it is, you can argue about your definition of consciousness and self, but it clearly does involve the passage of time. But the passage of time is a reference to mental time. And as I say, it's not because the physical time itself doesn't have a passage of time. But once you've got once you've got this extra dimension, then of course you can relate it to this physical time.
Bernardo, what is your...
I don't agree with you. Look, there obviously is something in experience that we refer to when we use the word time. It would be naive to deny that there is something in experience we refer to as time. Obviously, it is there. There is something we call time. It's part of experience. But I don't think it is what it seems to be when we conceptualize the notion of time. For instance, I don't think we, strictly and rigorously speaking, call the flow of time. Because we are only ever in the present moment. The past are memories experienced in the present moment. The future are expectations experienced in the present moment. We are only ever, always in the present moment. Now, there are properties of the experience of the present moment that we refer to as time. From that perspective, I think time requires experience because time is an aspect of experience. There is something about experience that we refer to as time. But I don't think experience requires literal time. I think time is in experience, not experience in time. And the relationship I see between mind and time, or the human mind and time, is different. It's not that the human mind requires the existence of time. The relationship I see there is the following. If you look at the three main metaphysical options on the table today, all three of them have a problem. In two of them, that problem is insoluble. And in one of them, you can solve it if you understand time. So let me be explicit about it. Physicalism says there are only physical entities. Mind is a product of physical entities arranged in a certain way. Well, that has the insoluble, hard problem of consciousness. There is nothing about physical properties in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience in principle. And then you have panpsychism. There are physical entities, but they have fundamental consciousness. Electrons are conscious, quarks are conscious, photons are conscious. The problem there is the combination problem. There is no coherent way to argue that fundamentally different subjects of experience, like two electrons in your head, can combine to form a seemingly unitary experience, namely you. You can't solve that. And then you have idealism, the third option, which also has a problem. Idealism says there is only one mind, and it's fundamental. So you don't have the combination problem because everything already starts combined. Everything is unitary. And you don't have the hard problem of consciousness because you don't need to produce mind. The mind is there from the beginning. Now you have the decomposition problem. How can one mind seem to be many? How can you be me while you are still you? How can Bernard be Bernardo at the same time that he's still Bernard? Notice what I just said, at the same time. the problem of how can you be me at the same time that you are you presupposes a linear, unidimensional understanding of time. Because I was my 5-year-old self. It was me right there. Is that a problem? No, because my 5-year-old self is in another point in time.
Yeah.
The problem is, how can you be me at the same time?
Yeah.
That's a problem if time is only one dimension. But if it's not, if it's multi-dimension like Bernard is proposing, then you are talking to you across a different timeline.
That I just don't understand.
And that is not
but
a problem.
This is mind-bending. Can you explain it to me, Bernard? What Bernardo is saying?
I can
I
try
like
to,
the
because
argument.
we had a dialogue in print about it, so I could certainly expand on that. And let me just say, I tend to agree with the general remarks that Bernardo was saying. I have got idealistic inclinations. Maybe as a result of talking to Bernardo.
So mind experiences time, and that mind is in time. You just said that.
I want to go back to what Bernardo said at the beginning, because I sort of agree with his general statement, but I slightly disagree when he was talking about time itself, because he said there's only the now, and there's the past and the future, but you only expect the now. But I would like to say to Bernardo, well, that's in our current state where we have our species present of a tenth of a second. But what if you can experience a state of mind where the past and the present and the future are experienced now? Now that's the point of my higher dimensional picture, because I'm associating these higher dimensions with a bigger specious present. And so Bernardo is happy with the idea of extra time dimensions, so we're agreeing there. But one of the features of these extra time dimensions is that what we call now is bigger. So when you say that we are only aware of now, you have to say, which now do you mean? Do you mean the now in this short specious present, or do you mean the now with a bigger specious present? And so that's the only aspect, the remark you said I disagreed with, but I am actually associating this bigger now with this extra, with this extra dimension of time.
Yeah, and consciousness with a big C, you call that, right?
Well, let me elaborate on that. I talk about consciousness with a little c and consciousness with a big C. In my perspective, that is rather simplistic, because in my view, which could all be wrong, it's just me theorizing. In my view, you have a hierarchy of states of consciousness, which correspond to a hierarchy of times.
Mm-hmm. Specious presences that sort of expand.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy of specious presence and a hierarchy of times. And so myself and Bernardo, we are separate at this level. But then there might be another level at which myself and Bernardo and everyone in this room has got a collective self. But it's still limited, it's still finite. Maybe I can experience the collective self of the whole planet, but it's still a self, it's still finite. It's just that within that bigger sense of self, the individual self of myself and Bernardo has dissolved. But then even that level of self, the planetary level of self, might just be one element of a galactic level of self.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and then you might have a galactic level of consciousness with a much bigger species present, which reconciles all the different planets. And then there might be a cosmic level of self, if you like. Now, that's in a way what I might be calling conscious with a big C, the final step.
It does make sense to me, just intuitively again, but you also like the image that Jonathan Schooler, he had this mosaic print. Let's say that we are all pixels with different, we're different frequencies.
The windows.
Our species presence, and when you zoom out, then it just becomes one image, and you zoom out further, and you can go on forever.
Absolutely, and so the point I'm making is that it's not there's just two states, little c and big C. In my picture, at least, there's a hierarchy of steps that you go up, and yes, I like Jonathan's view, because Jonathan's model is very similar to mine, but he came to it from a completely different direction. I mean, we had our theories independently, and then we realized they were the same when we've been talking to each other. So he has also the idea of an extra dimension, and he also has the idea of a specious present,
Yeah, the windows.
And for people,
exactly,
people
the
new,
nested window.
new to that term, so with specious presence, it's your smallest amount of time that you are consciously aware of, right? Is that a way to put it?
I'm using the phrase in the sense that William James used it, which was that it's the minimum time scale of which we can consciously experience, which I said was something like a tenth of a second.
Yeah, some people said it's a couple.
But that's simplistic because, I mean, first of all, there are many different sense modes. There's a visual specious present, there's a sound specious present. And well, I mean, there was a wonderful talk about this by Marc Wittman because he professionally studies the specious present. And, you know, there's a question of is it really a tenth of a second because how you define it is a little bit unclear. In fact, Germain de Canales wrote a book calling the tenth of a second. So quite a lot of people think of it as the tenth of a second. It doesn't really matter precisely what the specious present is. I think that Mark said, in fact, in some sense, it's more like 1 second than a tenth of a second. But that's not too important. The point is, the experience of time is discrete, and the point is that within this specious present, there is no distinction between past and future. Yeah. And in some sense, for me, it's even like a closed time-like curve. I'm sort of connecting the specious present with a closed time-like curve. But on the other hand, this is not a view that most physicists are going to entertain, and I doubt most psychologists will. I doubt many philosophers are going to like it because the strange thing, but Bernardo can comment about this, but when I read the philosophy of physics, no one seems to talk about the specious present. I mean, William James did, but Bergson did, but modern philosophers seem to have
philosophy of time, it's concerned primarily with the question of whether the past and the future have the same ontological status as the present.
Right.
That's the key fight between the time realists and the time nominalists.
That's the distinction in philosophy, those two camps.
Is the past real in the sense that the present is? Is the future real in the sense that the present is? Yeah. Do they really exist, the past and the future? And it's argued both ways by different groups. So that has been like forever the key discussion in the philosophy of time.
And like in philosophy today, if you would sort of your colleagues, in what camp are they? Is there sort of a mainstream position in this?
No. I think, well, maybe more now identify as time realists because of the block universe.
Yeah. But this is nice to make this bridge to Einstein because just very briefly for people new to it, we have Newton's conception of time. He had the 3 dimensions and saw time as sort of separate and sort of an absolute fundamental. And then Einstein, of course, saw that together they form the space-time dimension. And then we have the notion of the block universe in which somehow past, present, and future are in one block. Yep. And there's no flow of time. And only physicists, and it's just inconceivable for any normal person, though this is for physicists.
I know, but that's the block universe is the mainstream physics view. Not everyone. I mean, George Ellis gave a talk about the growing block universe. But so he believes in the block universe in the past, but not in the future.
So the mainstream perception is really that past, future, present have the same status.
Yes, and in George's picture, he's saying the past is fixed, but the future is still open because the growing is the present is moving. Yeah. I agree with the growing block universe, but I disagree with George in the sense that I claim George needs this extra dimension to describe the flow, and George resists that idea. At least he did before my talk. I don't know if he's changed his mind.
And then Paul Davies took a different position, right? I'm just checking. He's talking about the myth of passage, and also nice to reflect here on Einstein himself. A lot of the presentations quoted Einstein's sort of difficulty, his struggle with the passage of time, that he could not see it other than just an illusion.
Exactly. In fact, I think 3 of us use that quote, that passage of time is a stubbornly persistent illusion.
That's it.
Yeah. Because that is the implication of Einstein's special relativity. And all I can say is, I already have said, I don't think that's the full description of the world. And so I think Einstein was wrong on that. But you know, Einstein was a genius, the greatest physicist of the 20th century, but they often make mistakes, these geniuses.
Yeah, but it's just this moment when you have your math and your theory so heavily contradicting just what you experience as a human being. Bernardo, if I ask you as a philosopher, isn't it crazy to say that it's the most stubborn illusion, whereas you are performing physics in time, you know, and I'm trying to understand this.
The whole history of science has been a long series of refutations of what seems an obvious interpretation of experience.
That's true.
So there is no surprise there. To say that what we make of our experience is wrong is not to say that we don't have the experience. So when we talk about the passage of time, that's a conceptualization of something in experience that is real. But we may conceptualize it wrong, we may interpret it wrongly. What we make of it and transform into words may be wrong. And the history of science has been a steady parade of demonstrations that often these interpretations, these things we make of experience are wrong. I sympathize with something Paul Davies said today, which is that the whole discussion is muddled by imprecise language. That is also the whole history of philosophy and science, the muddleness of language. If we were more careful, thoughtful about how we use words, and spent more time trying to get across the way in which we are using our words instead of immediately interpreting what your opponent is saying in the most prejudicial way possible, we could solve a lot of dilemmas. For instance, we were talking about time realism or not.
Yeah.
Right? Is the past real? Is the present privileged ontologically with respect to the future and the past? You can coherently take either position and justify it. Even though you're not lying, you're not being insincere. It's just how you use the words. For instance, I could tell you honestly that I think there is only the present. Ever, only the present. Past and future are fictions. And then you would say, well, then Bernardo is not a time realist, because he denies past and future states. But then I will go ahead and say, I think past and future states are identical in kind and ontologically to present states. The past is not any different than the present. If the present is real, so is the past and so is the future. And then you might say, well, but then you're not a time realist, so you're contradicting yourself, right? Now let me show you how I'm not contradicting myself. I think what we call the past are memories experienced in the present. What we call the future are expectations experienced in the present. Therefore, past and future are present. And therefore, they're no different than the present.
Yeah.
And yet, there is only the present. You see?
Yeah.
But we get muddled in the way we use terms. And then we create these divisions where there may be none. I think the concept of time, and just to go back to something Bernardo said, Bernard.
I'm Bernard.
We are the same.
Yeah.
Something Bernard said just a moment ago. I think time, multidimensional time, I think it is true. I think it is true as the best conceptual model of something about experience that is true. I do not deny that. I think the model is the best. The multidimensional model of time is the only...
explain multidimensional
So
time.
we seem to experience time in only one dimension. It flows from the past to the future. It's a line. It's so narrow. It goes that way. But what if there are two arrows that are orthogonal or perpendicular to one another?
Time two.
Or even three.
Yeah.
Time three. These extra degrees of freedom that a multidimensional time model grant to us probably are the only way to account for certain aspects of experience that we refer to as time. Particularly the experience we seem to have that you are different than me, that I am me and you are you. We don't seem to experience the identity between us. No, Bernardo isn't Hans. Hans isn't Bernardo.
There's no way consciousness can do that if we have a one-dimensional time.
We cannot account for why you are not we cannot account for how you can be me while being yourself at the same time. We cannot account for that without the model of multidimensional time, without these extra degrees of freedom that this model will give us. And in saying that, I am acknowledging that this model of time is what we need, at the same time that I say what we call time is not literally the passage of anything. It's properties of experience, and experience is outside time. But we need a way to model these properties of experience, whatever they are. And I think the only way to do that, including the experience that I don't seem to be you, is multidimensional time. Do you understand what I mean?
I find this very hard to understand.
It is difficult to understand.
How would you put it?
Well, let me first of all say, Paul Davies referred to the muddlescape. And of course it's muddled. I mean, these are very difficult concepts, and I certainly don't claim to understand everything fully, so I'm very happy to be described as muddled. I think everybody's muddled. If you speak to the physicists or the philosophers or St. Augustine or anyone, they will all claim we don't really understand time. I mean, we can understand certain aspects of physical time, but not this deeper problem of time. You know, I talked before about this concept of a bigger specious presence. I mean, from the perspective of this extra dimension, all of space-time exists as one sheet, like this table, which includes the past, the present, and maybe the future, but at least a possible future. And so what Bernardo said about the past, the memory, it is literally true, because to me, the memory isn't something in your head. The memory is the fact you're connected with this space-time. And from this higher-dimensional perspective, you see the whole of space-time like a four-dimensional space-time, like the surface of a table. And so the memory, it is real in the sense that it's part of, it's just as real as the moment you're experiencing now, because the moment you're experiencing now is just a slice in this lower dimensional representation. Now, so that's how I look at it. And for example, we talk about the block universe. And I say, well, the block universe, I don't believe in the block universe because I think my consciousness can intersect it and make a choice. But that's from my perspective. Now, if you had a specious present, which was a cosmological timescale, then the block universe would be correct.
Yeah.
So even the phrase, the block universe, depends upon your perspective. It's not true from our perspective, because the point is that something which is undetermined in this dimension may be determined when you go to a higher dimension. So when you get down to this description of free will, we do have free will, but that doesn't mean that from this higher dimensional perspective, for which the past and future exists, it may not look as though you've got free will, because the higher dimensional perspective knows what you're going to do. But from the lower dimensional perspective, you do have a choice. So, but even that discussion is muddled because people are using the words in rather imprecise ways. And indeed, when I read papers on time by philosophers, they really are all very often just to do with semantics. And I suppose semantics are the attempt to make
physics. This is really where physics can help, right? Because you can bring with mathematics, you can help to sort of clarify that.
More precision.
Be more precise in that whole discussion.
That's how they can help the physicists, I suppose, by making the physicists more precise, because probably it's the physicists...
Oh, I'd say the other way around.
The physicists are precise in predictive models, like mathematical equations, but philosophers are indeed a lot more precise in language use. We saw it during the conference.
But because we can help each other in different ways. It's just that I find that the philosophers, apart from Bernardo, they're so focused on the semantics that they seem blind to the somehow more interesting aspects, sometimes, not all of them,
Wittgenstein concluded at the end of his life that the whole of philosophy was just a language game.
Yes, and he was...
that was his parting message to the world, and then he died of prostate cancer.
And of course he was a great philosopher, but then of course he ended up saying that he made his career on his first book.
Yeah, the first
that's right.
Wittgenstein. Yeah.
And then he ended up saying, "Oh, that's all wrong. Here's my second book." And so, but on the other hand, he was one.
That's philosophers.
Yeah, but there's nothing wrong with being wrong. I mean, physicists are often wrong, and often when physicists are wrong, that's what's most useful. I mean, a famous example of this is when Hawking discovered black hole radiation. He said, therefore, this produces what's called the information paradox. Because you lose all the information, and that goes against the principles of quantum mechanics. And this was very controversial. And in the end, Stephen conceded he was wrong. He waited 40 years. But the point is, he was wrong, but that was a really important mistake, because that mistake triggered 40 years of intense debate. And so mistakes, people don't realize sometimes mistakes in physics can be really useful. And because in trying to resolve the mistake, you find something completely new. And Einstein, the greatest physicist of the 20th century, he made lots of mistakes. But
I like the EPR. Isn't the EPR paper that led to Bell in a sense?
Well, that's quantum mechanics. But that's right. But even before that, I mean, he didn't believe in the expansion of the universe until it was demonstrated. He didn't believe in black holes until they were discovered 50 years later. And of course, he didn't believe in quantum theory. So Einstein was often wrong. But that doesn't matter, because even when he was wrong, I mean, one of his biggest mistakes was to say, when he had his Einstein's field equations of general relativity, he put in a cosmological constant, which is a repulsive term, in order to make the universe static, because he thought the universe was static. Then they discovered the expansion of the universe. This was 1929 or whatever. And he said, "Oh my goodness, I've made a huge mistake." And he said the cosmological constant was his biggest blunder, because
turns out he was right.
If he hadn't made that blunder, he could have predicted the expansion of the universe. But then, in 70 years later or whatever it was, they discovered the universe was accelerating because there is a cosmological constant.
Wow, it's amazing.
So his biggest
Dark
blunder.
energy.
So his biggest blunder was not actually saying there was a cosmological constant. His biggest blunder was saying that the cosmological constant was his biggest blunder. So you never know what's going to be. Things are unpredictable. Sometimes your mistakes are more helpful than what you do correctly.
I was also thinking about the discussion that we just had. I think we agree on just about everything regarding time and mind, with one exception. I think the difference between us is that I resist taking the model literally.
I mean, I tend to agree with that. I think all of these models, as they come from physics, I just think of them as models. I don't think they are reality, because the whole history of physics is one of progressive paradigm shifts, and at every stage you're changing. You're changing your description of the world in a subtle way. So the previous description still applied in a particular context, like Newtonian theory still works when you're not moving fast the speed of light. But you got Newtonian, the Einstein picture, that's a new paradigm, but it's a mental model. Then you have another paradigm with extra dimensions, that's another mental model. So in some sense, I see all of these paradigms as being provisional. I don't see, I mean, they're struggling towards some final reality, but I always assume the paradigm itself isn't the final reality. It's just a step on the way. So in that sense, I'm agreeing with you, because it is only a model. And that's the paradox, because physicists want to actually remove mind from the picture, but actually all physicists provide at the end of the day is a mental model. With mathematics. And I mean, and so it's so ironic to say we don't believe in mind, and the mental model always changes. And if you wait another 50 years, it'll be a different mental model. So I think I am agreeing with you. I mean, and I suppose, I mean, I wasn't using that as an argument for idealism, but the fact is that if your model of the world coming from physicists is a mental model, I suppose that is a tick for the idealist philosophy.
just what I'm trying to understand, but tell me if this is not relevant in relation to this conference, Bernardo, but the relationship between the conception of time in relativity theory by Einstein and quantum theory, and where they clash or where they... And from my understanding, so in the block universe, we have what's called world lines, right? I'm on my world line, you are on yours.
Yeah, and that's even if you have an evolving block universe, you have a world line.
Yeah. And it's I mean, Einstein noticed that we are not in the same time. It's observer dependent, right? It's you cannot say now. Is that right? I mean,
There's your now.
There's my now, exactly. There's my now.
I mean, there's here now. There's no universal surface of similar.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing where he says, I'm in between mirrors and I send a photon, and then when I have half the time, I can decide where my now is. But when you do the same flying past by in an airplane, your now will be different.
However, to be honest, even that is wrong, and George made this point, because the point is, in special relativity, there is no favored spatial hypersurface. There is no now. In relativity, in general relativity,
simultaneity. There is no universal.
There's no universal. It's arbitrary how you slice it.
Yeah.
But when you talk about cosmology, which is described by the solutions of general relativity, there is a favored slice. There is a favored time, and basically, it's the surface of the surface in 4 dimensions of constant distance from the Big Bang. So in fact, there is a favored time.
There's simultaneity on a cosmological level.
At a cosmological level, because general relativity changes some of the features of the world which you inferred from special relativity. So actually, this is the point, you see, about the evolving block universe. Many people would say, I can't believe in a growing block universe, because the growing block universe means there's a surface where separating past and future.
Yeah.
And they say, well, they can't be such a surface because of special relativity. But no, general relativity says there is a favored surface.
Yeah, the bubble of the Big Bang.
It's associated with the Big Bang.
It's the surface of the balloon.
Exactly.
Okay,
It's constant distance, constant time from the Big Bang. And the point is that it's a favored hypersurface. It's the one with which the universe all looks nice and smooth and symmetric. So actually, that was wrong. But on the other hand, there is a clash between relativity theory and quantum theory, which is most easily expressed in the following way. There is what's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says you can't measure the position and the velocity of a particle at the same time. Now, in a space-time diagram, as you said, a particle follows a world line. Well, the world line implies a position, but also the gradient of the world line, because this is time versus space, so the gradient, it tells you the speed. A world line requires a position and a speed, which is in conflict with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So you know right at the start that relativity theory and quantum theory are incompatible. And that's just to do with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Then you get to the problem of the EPR paradox, simultaneous. You know about the EPR paradox, but that basically there's this particle is in a state and this particle has to go in the same state even though they shouldn't be able to communicate. That's called non-locality or entanglement. That's also incompatible with relativity. So there are all sorts of incompatibilities. But the role of time is different in quantum theory than it is in relativity theory. In fact, I would say that in quantum theory, time is more like Newtonian time. It's sort of more absolute. That's why, because when you have entanglement, this correlations, it does require a sort of absolute time, a preferred space-like hypersurface. So in some sense, I always say that in quantum theory, time is rather Newtonian, but space is fuzzy because you've got this non-local, non-locality.
Yeah.
In relativity theory, time is fuzzy. It's the other way around. I mean, space is more absolute and time is fuzzy. And so that's another way in which they're incompatible. Probably when you get to quantum gravity, both space and time are fuzzy.
Yeah.
That provides a hint as well, because it seems to show some symmetries that are informal but maybe it can be more rigorously articulated and lead somewhere.
Yeah, of course, physicists do that, but you'll find that physicists, especially the physicists who talk about Planck effects, they do differ. So, for example, some people say that time is when you get to the quantum stage, that space is emergent, but that time is absolute, time is real. Now, Lee Smolin is like that, because this is in what's called loop quantum gravity. In some sense, loop quantum gravity says that time is special, but there are other
because
approaches.
it departs from quantum theory, because you just said quantum theory needs it to be. Is it for that reason?
It's not so much that it's just that he has a model in which time still exists at the quantum level. Because in the whole point about Smolin's picture is that he does believe in the flow of time. He does think time is special in some sense. But if you're into string theory, basically it comes down to whether you think your final theory is more like relativity theory or whether it's more like string theory. In other words, is it more like quantum theory? If you think it's more like quantum theory, you're going to be going to string. It'll be string theory for superstrings is an example of something which is more quantum in nature. But loop quantum gravity is more like relativity in some sense.
And is there in quantum theory then a flow or a passage of time? Because it seems to me you are studying sort of quantum systems which have a wave function, and a wave function demands sort of a progression in time. And so it seems to me that the quantum theory then does seem compatible with a flow of time or passage of time.
If you're talking about normal quantum theory, like the collapse of the wave function, that does require a time, because you've got your Schrödinger equation, which has t in it, so that has an evolution. But then the collapse is coming in time as well. So you have the collapse at a certain time. That's different from the problem of quantum gravity and quantum cosmology, because in quantum cosmology, in what's called the Einstein-DeWitt equation, you can actually remove time altogether. And so that's one of the arguments of Julian Barber, for example, who argues that time doesn't really exist. So at the level of quantum gravity, time may not exist and space may not exist. But at the level of ordinary quantum theory, the collapse of the wave function, there is certainly time.
Yeah, you invoke or you propose sort of a higher dimensions for mental states, for mind. Does that also mean that you think time, or do you think time is fundamental, or is it emergent somehow?
Well, at the level of quantum gravity, I mean, I tend to suspect both space and time are emergent, so I'm not sure whether I agree with Smolin, but I do think, I agree with Smolin that I feel that time is very fundamental at this stage in the universe. What happened to the Planck time, that's a different matter, but at this stage of the universe, I think time is fundamental, but I mean by that the flow of time, not just the ordinary physical time.
Lee also, in his presentation in the conference, of course he wrote a book about time being the only fundamental dimension, but I probably am wrong, but I sensed in his presentation yesterday that he was really favoring the present, that there is an attribution to more reality regarding present states than past and future states. And I construed that as a sort of a softening of his position on time. I don't know how you interpreted that.
I think that may be right. I mean, but on the other hand, I haven't read Lee's latest paper. I mean, I think that is the case. And in that sense, I'm sort of, I'm agreeing with many of the things that Lee says, because I do agree it's fundamental. And he said something else which I really sympathize with, this idea that the universe is the collection of all our partial
points of view of itself.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And that's actually precisely my perspective, because when I'm trying to construct this greater reality, the point of this greater reality is to show that you can reconcile people's different views of the universe, their partial views of the universe. But the only thing is, I'm not just talking about the physical universe, I'm talking about these more exotic experiences. So I really sympathize with that. If he's saying that the present is different from the past and future, I'm not sure I do agree with him. But then that's like our discussion we had earlier, that
He says, when I might take my notes, he said there is no future. That's what and the presence is where all dynamics of the universe exist.
Yeah, okay, so, but he's really talking about the physical universe. And so I'm not quite sure. It's strange because he is making reference to subjectivity. He even had the word qualia in his title.
Yeah, and he acknowledged present states or novel states, as he called it, states that result from observation. They are fundamentally qualitative. He acknowledged that even in the Q&A.
I think from your perspective, Bernardo, that's gratifying because you can see he's moving
it was music to my
in
ears,
an idealistic view. However, I'm not sure that he would have. For example, I don't know that he gives much credence to the higher dimensions. So I don't think he would agree with my model because actually Lee has written a book saying you shouldn't believe in higher dimensions and things like that.
He says fields are emergent. Fields are higher dimensions, right?
Well, no, I mean, everything is a field, but I mean, the point is that the normal fields are in space-time.
Okay.
Electromagnetic fields. I mean, most things, everything in physics now is associated with a field. I mean, there's the electromagnetic field and gravitational
field. Quantum theory. Yeah.
But even particles are associated with fields. So everything's associated with a field, but they're normally fields in space-time.
Yeah.
Not in these higher dimensions. And the question is, what happens if you allow them to be in these higher dimensions? In the simplest picture of M theory, all these extra dimensions are wrapped up. So you don't really have to care about the fifth coordinate. But if you have a model where the extra dimensions are extended, like in brain cosmology, then things are a function of the extra coordinates as well, and it gets more complicated. But the point is that Lee wasn't talking about that. And in fact, Lee is addressing the question of quantum gravity and bypassing the question of extra dimensions. And also, you know, even string theory has extra dimensions, but it doesn't actually address the problem of quantum gravity or quantum, because an ultimate description of quantum gravity will presumably be beyond space and time altogether. Even in my talk, I gave some quotes about people saying the fundamental theory of physics will transcend space and time altogether. And obviously, string theory is in terms of dimensions. So even M theory is not going to be the final picture according to quantum gravity, because quantum gravity says the final picture with no space and time and no extra dimensions. So it's people in physics are working in different areas, and they don't always talk to each other. So the relationship between quantum gravity, quantum cosmology, or string theory is not clear. I mean, I like to think that as you go back to the Big Bang, you eventually get to a state where the universe is high dimensional. But then it may eventually get to a state where there's no space or time at all. It all depends what the nature of that Big Bang was. So, but we don't know. I mean, Paul talked about the muddle-scape of time. You could talk about the muddle of quantum gravity, because none of us know the answer. And these problems are very complicated. And everybody has their different views. I mean, Stephen Hawking worked on quantum cosmology, which he regarded as his most important work, the no boundary condition, and the work he did with Hartle and people. But then you heard George Ellis saying he didn't believe in quantum cosmology. So physicists disagree among themselves. Physicists disagree among themselves. So it's very hard to generalize saying, oh, physicists are open to this, because physicists have all sorts of different theories and they disagree.
Bernardo, well, great to already have explored sort of just very intuitively, organically what has been discussed at the conference, but also nice for people watching who will be able to watch all full presentations in videos we will also publish. You just briefly run through the presentations given at the conference, and we can just discuss what comes up and what we found intriguing, fascinating, or raised questions. So we had George Ellis giving a presentation saying there is no physical way a block universe can have come into existence. The future is not yet determined. So this was the idea of an evolving or...
this is what's called the growing block universe.
Growing block universe.
Which says that you've got, in some sense, the past is fixed, as it would be in Einstein's prescription, but the future is still open. And indeed, that there is still a now, in the sense that there is a favoured surface of constant time beyond which the future is undetermined. And I mean, not all physicists believe that. The standard Einstein view is that the block universe is fixed in both the past and the future. That is, of course, what doesn't accord with experience. And so the idea is that the future is still undetermined, and it's called a growing block universe. The idea goes back a long way, but the idea is that you're thinking of your future world lines. Instead of being determined, they're moving in time. Like, you can think of the future as being like a dotted line where it's somewhat uncertain, and the past as being a solid line. And so the advantage of that view is that it does allow for the existence of a now. In other words, it does allow for a passage of time, and you can interpret that in various ways. It might relate to the collapse of the quantum wave function, etc. One feature of that model is that you do need to have a preferred surface of constant time. Now, in special relativity, there is no preferred surface of constant time, because different observers move with different speeds, and therefore they have different space and time axes. But the point is, in cosmology, which is general relativity, there is a preferred time, and it's the cosmic surfaces which are equal, all clocks on which have equal time since the Big Bang. So that's fine, and I like that idea. And I do, however, feel that George's model doesn't actually describe the passage of time, because you still, in my account, you still need some extra dimension in which to describe the passage of time. I mean, there's no passage of time in George's picture, even though he does. I mean, he draws successive diagrams in which the future has shifted, but there isn't an actual explicit description of the passage of time.
That's your question there. And Bernardo, I think George Ellis mentioned, I wrote that down, that human imagination changes the future, which I found interesting. So he gives sort of a position for the observer or agency in this expanding block universe. And also he made reference to, that's by, I forgot the writer's name, Louis Borges, I think is it, the Library of Babel story, you know that? And it relates to all books being possible, all books that can be written in this library, but also all the nonsense, and then relating that to sort of possibility spaces. So to me, it seems as if the agent can then open one of these books, thereby sort of evolving in this expanding block universe. Is that sort of a way to look at it? Am I now messing up concepts here?
No, I think it's coherent what you said. In George's presentation, he, at the very least, attempted to validate a number of our intuitions, like the future is not determined, so that would at least postpone a reckoning with the possible non-existence of libertarian free will. The notion of time is validated to some extent. I think at least one of the arguments he made, I thought didn't quite hold, which is he was arguing against an idea that many philosophers have, that time doesn't really exist. It's there is something in experience that we refer to as time, but it is not what it seems to be. There isn't time as we normally or ordinarily like to think of it. And he argued against it by saying, well, even our perceptual processes unfold in time. So we cannot say that time is an illusion because our very perception unfolds in time. I don't think that holds, because it doesn't add an argument against the original assertion that time is an illusion, because the original assertion can be applied to the very notion that perception unfolds in time. So I'm not saying that the original assertion is right or wrong. What I'm saying is that his refutation doesn't refute it.
Yeah.
Because the same original argument can be made for his original refutation. But he feels passionately about his position. That was clear from his presentation. And I think that's a good thing. I think this notion of what Nietzsche called science made by frogs with cold entrails, purely objective theoreticians and observers, that's a fiction. I think we have to mobilize all of our human faculties when we are doing science and doing philosophy. And he does that, and I sympathize a lot with that. I think that's authentic, that's honest, and that's good.
And we had a lot of, I think, people who did indeed, you can see that they were passionate about their ideas that maybe needed working on, but already sort of triggered a lot of interesting thoughts. If we move on, for instance, to Lee Smolin, who had a presentation, the role of qualia in temporal naturalism. I found Lee's, and I really understand like 15% of it, you know that, but I really found that very thought-provoking, especially we mentioned it already earlier, that he said stuff like present events and their views are fundamental. He said the universe is nothing but a large number of partial views of itself, which seems to me like bordering on like a pure idealist standpoint. So what did two of you think of Lee's presentation? Was it sort of new to you, his position?
The remark that the universe is this set of partial views of itself, I completely resonate with, and it's very much in accord with my own approach, which is to define a reality in terms of the fact that you have some structure which contains all the different observers and the objects and defines all the different partial views, if you like, and reality is what meshes them all together. And so I fully agree with that. The only thing is, I suppose, that my view of reality goes beyond the pure physical world. But it's an extension of that idea of the partial views. Of course, the other important point about Lee's approach is that he is saying that time is fundamental, that the passage of time is real. And to that extent, I agree with him. But in some sense, though, there's the question of what happens at the level of quantum gravity, where we know space and time break down, and you have to argue about whether space is emergent or time is emergent. Lee is taking the view that in some sense time is fundamental, but that space may be emergent. And one has to realize that other physicists who work in this area take the opposite view. Some people think that actually it's time which is emergent rather than space which is emergent. It just
fascinates me how that works. If you are a physicist, it seems from the outside almost as a matter of taste, and it's of course not. But is it sort of, you just look at the math and the empirical data, and is it then just a sense of intuition? Okay, I'm going for this route or that route. I'm putting my chips on time or on.
It all depends on which approach to quantum gravity you're taking. There are about five different approaches to quantum gravity, and in some of them, Lee is correct, and in others he isn't correct. So the fact is, this is the most challenging problem in modern physics, because we don't know the answer. We haven't yet got that final theory which marries quantum theory and relativity. They're different approaches.
Yeah.
And one approach is loop quantum gravity, and that's something Lee is associated with. And that's more like relativity theory, and that is allowing time to be more fundamental, and space becomes emergent. But other theories like string theory are more quantum-like. So no one knows, and everybody just pushes for their own model, and we'll try and find out.
Yeah.
We hope eventually which model is correct. But yeah. I certainly like some aspects of Lee's approach. But
I think where we couldn't, or at least we already talked a bit about that, where he was a bit harder to follow for me at least, was in how he would integrate qualia in his theory. I mean, I think his time was also limited, so that part of his presentation did not get as much time as the earlier. Did you follow there, Bernardo, how he accounted for qualia, or how he wanted to integrate it in his approach?
Well, his slides were very dry, and as you said, he had very little time for that part. But I do think that, by the way, I loved his presentation. I would put it in number one of the conference, despite the dry, sort of very sober, black and white slides. All the color and vividness of how his thoughts have evolved since last time I looked were plain to see, and I think it's a significant evolution. What you're asking specifically about, the role of qualia, you said you didn't understand most of his talk. That's a virtue compared to misunderstanding most of his talk, and I may be guilty of the latter. Maybe I misunderstood most of his talk, so you should take what I'm about to say with a whole bag of salt. But what I understood he was trying to say, he gave some kind of ontic privilege to the states of the present. He somehow made the present more real in some way, in some sense.
Yeah.
And present states, he divided in two categories. Present states with precedence that somehow follow deterministically from a chain of causation, and he associated that with the wave function, Schrödinger's equation, which is deterministic but only valid for large numbers and not applicable to individual events, doesn't predict individual events. And then the results of observation, what happens after the so-called collapse of the wave function, whether it happens or not, whether it's just decoherence or something else going on, the results of observation, he called them novel states, I believe, which are not fully determined by their precedents. And he stated that those states, which constitute the world we know, because the world we know is the world that arises from observation. That's all we really know, pre-theoretically. And then he said, these states are fundamentally qualitative. And then there was a question from the audience. Somebody was asking exactly that. Can you confirm this? And then he said, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And look, I think it would be unfair to try to extract the word idealism out of Lee's mouth, as unfair as it is unnecessary, because we attribute different meanings to words. Do we mean Bishop Berkeley subjective idealism, or do we mean a Kantian epistemic idealism? Do we mean objective idealism? So it doesn't matter whether the word idealism came or not out of his mouth. The substance of what was he saying dovetails well with modern forms of objective idealism. And I think that's wonderful for me.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, to me, I already said it would also be false to label him as a cubist, because it would sort of deny the Bayesianism.
Yeah, because if we use specific words like this, like cubism, then he would go to this math and say, am I applying Bayesianism here? And no, therefore not cubism. But I understand the association you made. The spirit of it, the smell of it, is related to cubism. I understand that. Yeah,
I found it very interesting, and I really would love to sort of have an in-depth interview with him as well. Then, Bernard, you gave a presentation on your model, which is invoking you say we need a higher dimension of time to accommodate for mind, right? We already discussed that, but I like your idea.
That's the first step, that you need. Yeah. You need a higher dimension to explain consciousness at all.
Yeah.
And then I argued that actually you need more than one dimension, because, well, one thing I did, I related this extra dimension to brain cosmology, because that brain cosmology is at least legitimate physics.
Brain,
B-R-A-N-E. This is the idea that the physical world is a slice of this five-dimensional bulk. And in brain cosmology, it moves through the bulk. And I actually wanted to associate this extra dimension in the bulk with this higher time, this mental time. And it may be crazy, but that's a way in which you can link consciousness, the passage of time, with an idea which comes out of modern physics. But the story doesn't stop there, because then the idea is that they may be other dimensions. Jonathan Schooler talked about a third dimension, but in my model, I'm partly motivated by the fact that in string theory, you have extra dimensions. But to be honest, my higher dimensional theory of mind was before string theory. I've been banging on about this for about 40 years, I suppose. And so when string theory came out, the higher dimension, because string theory M theory has 11 dimensions. So, but 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, and then 7 extra dimensions. But when string theory came out, I actually thought, oh, great, this confirms my theory. So often it looks as though I'm just taking string theory and saying, oh, let's use this to make a model of mind. But actually, the theory of mind, my model of mind came before string theory. Yeah. So in some sense, it might be said to predict string theory. And I mention that because actually, a lot of physicists don't like string theory. I mean, someone like George Ellis, for example, isn't going to be keen on string theory, nor does Lee Smolin.
Yeah,
he wrote
a book against it.
He wrote a book about it. In fact, I'm not sure any of the physicists other than me at present at the conference are keen on string theory. But the point is, it's not string theory itself. It is the invocation of extra dimensions. And it doesn't bother me whether string M theory itself is right. I'm just saying you need some form of higher dimensional space. And of course, some people won't like higher dimensions anyway, because they'll think it's mathematics or philosophy rather than physics.
Yeah, I think what's valuable about your approach is we see already the difficulty in conferences like these to bring in parapsychological phenomena and to discuss them openly scientifically without sort of saying stuff that only puts skeptics more in the skeptic camps, and you really help in trying to understand it and to make that sort of tangible. I think for the audience is, for instance, we discussed this earlier with Natalia, also in an interview we did with you. The movie Interstellar, for instance, also uses, this is Kip Thorne who advised, you know him, I think, as well. Who introduces bulk space, and he then bulk beings. He introduced to move in a tesseract is a 5-dimensional structure, I think, right?
Maybe I forget the details.
Anyways, he comes up with a higher dimensional theory that is compatible with physics to explain a parapsychological phenomenon, you could say, namely Cooper, the main character in the movie, communicating back in time with his own daughter. I mean, if that would happen, if you wouldn't see it in a movie like this, you would say this is like a psychic phenomenon, right? Because books are put out of the shelf that communicate with his daughter, but this is all wrapped in a science fiction movie, and then all of a sudden we think, wow, maybe this could be. And you, in a sense, are trying.
That's why I like that movie. It's in some sense, it's talking about black holes and higher dimensions, but also associating higher dimensions with mind in some sense and mental experience. But it's an interesting thought because, Kip is a great physicist. He's got the Nobel Prize for his work in gravitational waves. But Kip was also the person who pioneered the idea of wormholes being used as time machines. You've got a rotating wormhole, you go in one mouth and you come out the other mouth before you went in the first mouth. But despite the fact that he's such a great relativist, he came under a lot of criticism for that. Some people were saying, oh, this is crazy. Why is Kip getting involved in things like that? And it's the same with Penrose. Penrose is he's probably the greatest relativist of the age, who again got the Nobel Prize. And yet, when he talks about his theories of microtubules and consciousness interaction with the brain, he gets a lot of criticism. So, because a lot of physicists say this is crazy, and even the neuroscientists say this is crazy. So, even if you're a great physicist, it doesn't mean everyone's going to believe you, even if you got a Nobel Prize. So, and if they're going to get flack for saying it, obviously someone like me, who is a much lesser being, is going to get flack. So part of the problem is when you talk about these ideas, is that you have to put your head on the parapet and take a risk, because there are all these taboo words in physics, and consciousness used to be a taboo word. 20, 30 years ago, in physics, not in all subjects, but in physics it was a taboo word, but now it's acceptable because of developments in quantum theory and AI and things like that. But a word like parapsychology is still taboo. And so I know if I say anything, make any reference to parapsychology, or a parapsychological phenomenon like telepathy or premonition or whatever, I know I'm going to get into trouble with a lot of people. And now, before I retired, that used to concern me, because it meant that, I probably wouldn't lose my job, but I might not get a grant, or I might not get promotion, or my colleagues might suffer. Now I'm retired, so it doesn't really bother me. But nevertheless, I'm still a little bit wary, because to be honest, talking in front of friends who I know are not physics friends, who I know are going to think this is crazy, makes you a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I almost felt that I thought it's such a shame that, especially someone like you who has such a reputation, being such a renowned physicist, has to be so cautious talking about stuff like this. But that's just how it is. Then, right?
And I'm not sure it matters so much because, as I say, I've retired now. But it's force of habit, I suppose. Yeah. What was so nice about this meeting was that you had young people. You had people like Alex and Julia openly talking about these phenomena, and that, to me, that was very gratifying because they're young people too, and they're willing to take the risk. And I don't know. I mean, I think even Bernardo is very cautious when he talks about these things because he knows in the academic context it may get him into trouble. But I don't know how you reacted, Bernardo. Were you embarrassed by this emphasis, or were you gratified?
No, I'm not embarrassed. No. The fact that you don't hear me talk much about parapsychology is not as much out of stepping on eggs and being careful about how I'm perceived. It's not as much, managing my image, as it is because I am in constant wonder of the ordinary. I find the ordinary mind-boggling.
Yes.
And because I am overwhelmed by the ordinary all the time, the so-called extraordinary, for me, gets overwhelmed by that. I have seen what I consider to be undeniable instances of parapsychological phenomenon happening with my partner, my girlfriend, Claudia, who you both know. Things that had a level of specificity and detail that, there's just no way this can be just a coincidence. She experiences this as it's just what is, right? No big deal. So I if you ask me, do you think this stuff happens? I'm not give a blanket endorsement to every report because I don't know what they contain. But that stuff of that kind happens. I think it does to the point that it's almost banal. But I don't talk about it because the ordinary, for me, is so without basis, without an account in mainstream culture, that all my attention goes to the ordinary.
I understand that, and I think this emphasizes the point we made before, that we have to have a model of normal experience.
That's it.
But on the other hand, there's another quote which I made. I think that in some sense, you learn most about consciousness when you study those anomalies associated with very rare or rarer mental experiences. So that's the other side of the coin, I suppose. And so when you talk about my model, the 5 dimensions is just explaining ordinary experience. I'm also interested in explaining other experiences, such as OBEs and NDEs and apparitions or mystical experiences, all those sorts of phenomena. Most physics colleagues will say, I don't believe in that, because they're the ones that require a more sophisticated model with extra dimensions. Going beyond 5 dimensions, because I'm invoking, I don't say how many dimensions, but it has to go beyond 5. But on the other hand, I agree with Bernardo. I mean, there's enough to focus on in the ordinary world, which is why physicists are focusing just on that. There's plenty of wonder and joy just looking at the physical world.
Absolutely agree.
If we can have a new way of thinking about personal identity in terms of multidimensional time, it can be enormously useful even for philosophy.
Yeah.
Now we've deviated somewhat from Jonathan's talk, although of course it came out of this.
You were happy with that one, right? Because it very much builds on your own.
Well, we came at these models independently, so I don't think I should say it builds on it. I knew nothing about Jonathan's work till about 5 years ago, and then I met him at a conference, and learnt about this. And he has something like this extra dimension. He has something corresponding to the specious present. He has another feature. He has this third dimension. And I haven't quite worked out how that third dimension relates to mine, because I have a third dimension of time as well, but it's associated with the specious present. So I haven't quite worked out in my own mind exactly how his third dimension, which in some sense relates to the many worlds picture, where you have many different possible futures, and that's why he invokes that third time. But in some sense, I also have many possible futures in my model. So I haven't quite worked out the relationship between his third time and my third time.
What about the relationship between his hierarchical cognitive windows in your specious present? We touched on it in the panel today, but we didn't really go much.
Exactly. I mean, I think his nested windows does relate to my hierarchy of specious presence.
He talked about nested observer windows. What does he mean
about
with that?
Nested observer windows, but they're also basically on different time scales. So it maps very naturally into my terminology of a specious present, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I was interested in was how wide he thought this nested window was, because you could have inferred from what he was saying, he was sort of talking about everything being brain-based. And I did ask him, I said, well, look, what's the range of frequencies in some sense associated with these nested windows? Are you going to go down to a nanosecond? Are you going up to 1,000 years? And he sort of said yes. So I think that although you could interpret his model as being rather brain-based, I think in actual fact, he's quite open to the sort of idea I'm talking about, which is not brain-based.
Oh, but he said that. At the end of his presentation, at the very end, somebody asked the question, and then he almost, in an embarrassed way, said, well, you know, what I really think about these things is that experience is primary, consciousness is primary.
And then it came as a sort of after.
It just came out.
Yes.
And I wrote down here, time is moving through consciousness. As I think I quoted him here. Do you guys remember him saying that?
Yes. He had this picture of the elevator and the man.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I've always thought the distinction between you moving through time and time moving through you, it's always seemed to me, in some sense, just
you're saying the same thing in different ways.
It just seems to be a rather semantic thing. I've never been particularly struck by that, but he put a lot of attention to that.
And that nice image of a mosaic, right? If say these different nested observer windows are like pixels, we zoom out, we get a bigger picture in a...
Yes, but you see, when you're talking about pixel, you're normally talking about discreteness in space.
Yeah.
Okay? And when I'm talking about specious present, I'm talking about discreteness in time. But the two are related. The two issues are related because, I argue when we come back to the question of why am I Bernard, not Bernardo, it comes down in my explanation, at least, to the notion of the specious present. On the resolution of a specious present of a second or whatever, I am different. But if you look on the resolution on a time scale of 100 years, we're indistinguishable. But the same is true from a spatial point of view. Because if you look at me, you can say there's one head and there's my head. But if you now imagine going into really very small scales, so you're the size of an atom, you can't see where Bernardo begins and where I end. You know, it's just a stream of like galaxies in the sky. You know, it's just there's no defined identity. If you go 100 light years away, well, not 100 light, you go to the other side of the planet, you're not going to see the distinction between myself and Bernardo, because the separation is less than you can resolve. So it's the same, whether it's spatial resolution or temporal resolution, it's the same message. The identity, the separation and separate identity only works on a narrow range of space or time scales.
Interesting.
Bernard wrote an essay on our website, essentialfoundation.org, where he elaborates on all these ideas.
Oh,
so
great.
I would strongly encourage the viewers
definitely.
to have a look. It's not long, and it's accessible, has diagrams, very easy.
We will put the link below in the description.
But it was a response to Bernardo's essay, so he was...
I've been trying to poke him to write down these ideas for the past several years. My latest project is convince him to write a book. I'm not sure how far
Bernard, you're
I am.
invited. You're invited to do so. And today we open with Marc, the second day of the conference with Marc Wittman. And Marc is a psychologist.
A psychologist. Yeah.
Psychologist. And he said a lot of interesting things. First, what did you find most interesting?
Well, I mean,
in his talk?
first of all, of course, he was talking. He's one of the prime researchers into the whole field of what I'm calling the specious present, but that's the old-fashioned term. He's not using that term, but it's essentially the same idea. So he's studying how the specious present, to use my term, varies in different states of consciousness and how you can monitor that in the brain. But he's very much interested in this from the embodied point of view. One of his points was that your experience of the passage of time is very much related to your body, not just the brain, but to the whole body. Yeah. And I thought that was very, very important. I like the way his talk brought together both psychology and philosophy and biology. I thought that I like this idea, that it isn't just the brain. In fact, I think it was in response to his talk, I made a remark that when you talk about the filter theory, it's not just the brain which is a filter, it's the body which is a filter of...
He talked about a research he had done with a heartbeat slowing down during interval reproduction. So he had a sort of a setup where people had to sort of assess between intervals to assess sort of a time frame or something.
Yes, I mean, I can't answer too specifically. I mean, I remember the reference to heartbeat.
But at least it was indeed this point that we need to extend beyond mind as something in the brain and need to embody it. And it's also linking to enactivism.
Yes, but this is why it was slightly...
Yeah.
This is why it was slightly puzzling, because he was emphasizing the body all along. So I assumed that he was going to say that everything is related to brain function or body function. But then at the end, he was talking about his study of people having ayahuasca and mystical experiences. He seemed to be agreeing that this could go beyond any simple clock in the brain. So I found that rather intriguing.
I thought he was coming from a phenomenology perspective, a very German phenomenology
perspective. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And he had a lot of interesting quotes from those philosophers too.
But and this one I want to ask you, Bernardo, he said something like that the self needs a past, and so time and self are very much linked. And to me, that sounded very interesting from an idealist perspective. If you have if you want to sort of dissociate, you need time to dissociate to create selves, because selves need pasts.
Whatever account we come up with our intellect, will seem to need time, because time is built into how we think. Yeah. We think in extension. We think in terms of separation in space and separation in time. So I interpreted. I mean, to me, one of the key points he made 3 good points. One of them, the first one, was the one you're alluding to, which is that even to have an experience of the present moment, let alone an idea of self, even to have the raw experience of the present moment, the present moment needs some extension in time. It cannot be instantaneous. For instance, if you are listening to music, music only makes sense if when you hear a note, you also experience the previous notes. Yeah. Otherwise, you just have tones.
There's no melody.
You don't have melody. Even events, the dynamics of change, they are only dynamic if you have an experience of earlier states. Otherwise, it's just a series of snapshots. There is no movement. There is no change. It's just frozen snapshots. And he even concluded that this extension is about 2 to 300 milliseconds, did he say, or 2 to 3 seconds? 2 to 3 seconds, I think, was his conclusion. And the way he was talking about it, the way he was couching it in language, I think would have motivated most viewers to think that experience requires extension. That without extension in time, there is no experience. But I interpreted him differently. I even asked the question at the end, but he was not sure he had understood the question very well, so he sort of skirted around it. I think what he's showing is that the experience of the moment requires the experience of memory. When we hear a melody, we are not hearing the previous notes because they're gone, they are in the past. What we are experiencing is the memory of the previous notes concurrently with the experience of the current note. You see? When we experience change, what we are experiencing is the current state and the memories of previous states. So we don't experience an extended moment. We experience only the now, but part of the now is the experience now of memories. In other words, experience doesn't require extension. It's extension that requires experience reflected in memory. That's how I see that from an idealist perspective, because I think, like Kant, like Schopenhauer, and like a lot of modern cognitive neuroscientists, I think
extension. So one time again, extension needs
experience.
Experience.
Extension only exists in experience. It's a
experience combined with experiencing a memory.
Yeah, but you experience that memory now.
In the now.
You only ever experience memory now. You don't experience memory.
And
some abstract.
How does this relate to then? He also mentioned selflessness because he did research with a Buddhist monk who then says that perception and perceiver are becoming one, or selflessness and timelessness onto each other. How does what you are saying right now? How do you get to a point of selflessness, so to speak?
He touched upon physical boundary dissolution while you were in a sensory deprivation, in a floating rest. He mentioned that, but he didn't elaborate on it. He mentioned there was something else he talked in this regard, that when you are in a state of flow, when you're engaged in experience, the notion of self disappears. And when you are bored, then you're engaging the default mode network. He didn't use this terminology, but that's where it comes from in neuroscience. And then the experience of self becomes highlighted, exacerbated against a sort of a dull background of boredom.
I find the link with music rather interesting. I mean, this didn't come up at the time of the talk, but after you just said it, because in some sense, the whole point about music, the note has an individual identity, but actually there's also the identity at the level of the piece of music. And it's rather analogous to saying you have an identity now, but then there is a longer term identity associated with the Bernardo was born and lived all the way until now.
Oh yes, that's a good point.
It's a very nice analogy because, and also there's a hierarchy there because you've got the note, you got the movement. And the whole symphony or whatever. So I'd not thought of that analogy, and I'm not sure if that was part of Marc's point, but it's a nice point.
Nice. Let's move on to the presentation given by Alex Gomez Marin. I pronounced it right?
Yes.
He was very passionate, right? And in the end, in the panel discussion, he said, where do I have it, that we are in a phase of terminal, materialism is in a phase of terminal lucidity.
Yes.
So he was very much raging against sort of, and pledging for metaphysical disclosure, that people need to disclose their metaphysical position, right? And people saying they're agnostic, that is a position in itself. So it was very much a very broad-ranging presentation on the need to move towards a post-materialist approach, right?
It was very different from the other presentations because he didn't actually use any slides. So he was depending on his words, and his words. And actually, for the sort of talk he gave, I think that was probably very effective because he's a very passionate speaker.
Absolutely.
And that came across very well. But he also has some very memorable phrases.
Yeah.
Which was, I mean, he's very good with these pithy remarks, and
The sound bites that are sharp and to the point.
He made this remark, the mind is what the brain does, just as time is what clocks do, and which was a nice phrase. He made this reference to...
and that was a criticism against the notion that the mind is what the brain does.
Exactly, of course, but it's the same criticism, but because time isn't just what clocks do.
And he's a neurophysicist, by the way, for people.
Well, the interesting thing is he is a neuroscientist, but he didn't actually say much about neuroscience, which I found rather interesting.
But he had a physics background.
He had a physics background, and then he has, but he's, and actually he brought in philosophy and history, that
art and show of general culture.
Exactly, it was a very broad talk, and that to me was what made it rather valuable, that he brought everything together.
He clearly has a classic Iberian education, which is something that is rare in the North, where people are more pragmatic.
I wrote down here that when he said Chronos versus Kairos, two notions of time.
That, of course, is what much of the discussion had been about the previous day. Chronos versus Kairos is precisely objective versus subjective time.
But then that you can only speak about Chronos from Kairos, and that resonates with me, right? But we already discussed that.
Yes, we talked about that. I mean, I liked his reference to the view from nowhere. I mean, I think Bernardo was telling me that the view from nowhere is a reference to some previous philosopher, but he distinguished the view from nowhere, which is this traditional theory of everything, with the view from somewhere. I quite like that phrase. And then the other thing he talked about, of course, was the whole concept of edge science. Now, edge science are those things on the border of science which are controversial, which are precisely the things like ESP and altered states of consciousness under ayahuasca and things like that. So what he was really, it was a plea for edge science and also an argument that you should go beyond materialist science. I think you just quoted Bernardo, his lovely quote about edge science being in a state, materialist science being in a state of terminal lucidity. And that was a lovely phrase too. So it was a very broad talk, and I'm not sure how the audience reacted, but I thought it was what we needed, because it generally got the audience.
And nice that it's coming from a younger generation.
From a younger generation, and someone who's prepared to use the P word.
Yeah.
I mean, paranormal or whatever. So I don't know how you react.
And do you think it's different now that he can really say stuff like this, or you also think for this younger generation, science, it still can be damaging for their reputation or academic career?
Well, I don't know. It certainly
right?
would have been damaging for me at this stage. But we're in the middle of a transition. I think this new paradigm is going to come fairly soon. And once the paradigm has come, these people will be okay. They'll be leading. But the answer to that question depends exactly on timescales. And I don't think he's going to be down. He's got lots of positions. He's the director of the Paris Center. I mean, and so I suspect he's going to do fine. But
he's going to do fine.
But you know, there's always a risk.
Nice to hear more from him and to see his slides next time. I'm curious if he works.
But you know, anyone with these bold ideas, you're used to the idea that if you have a bold idea, you might get into trouble. I mean, Galileo, at least it lived. Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake. I mean, it's dangerous. It's dangerous pushing new paradigms.
Yeah, it is.
To your career, I don't mean you're going to get assassinated, but
I think you'll be fine.
I think you will too.
I suspect you'll be fine.
I think you'll be fine too. I was very glad he could contribute.
Yeah. From the older generation, we then had Paul Davies, The Modelscape of Time. We already discussed a bit Paul Davies' ideas. He's talking about the myth of the passage of time. And he said something that intrigued me, and we sat next to each other, Bernardo, and you said, this is important, so I'm asking you now, because I don't fully grasp it. I am fixed and time changes, or time is fixed and I change?
That's crucial. It's a crucial idea. What he's arguing is that there is time, but there is no passage of time. And I agree, actually. We can we can build the passage of time in our models because it's useful.
Yeah.
It gives us a way of thinking about things. It gives us a way to predict how nature will behave.
Yeah.
But
Just a little pause for people, because we only think of time as something flowing and passing, but if we have the block universe image, it is these different slices, let's say, of T1, T2, but there's no way that they will flow into each other. We just have them sitting there.
They're not passing.
They're not passing into each other. They're just different.
It's a set of relationships in nature that exist.
Check, yeah.
That's it. They exist. The relationships we refer to as time, they exist.
Yeah.
They're not flowing, they're not passing. Now, why do we think time passes? It's because we hold on to the illusion of fixed identity. If we are fixed and the world is changing, then from our reference point, which is fixed, we are the same person, then time is passing. But we are not fixed. You know, the molecules in my body have changed their positions. Some of them left, others have come in through breathing, through sweat, since I started this sentence. I am completely different from what I was when I was 5 years old. There isn't a single atom in my body today that was there and didn't leave since I was 5 years old. My thoughts are different, my opinions are different. I look very, very different, unfortunately. Everything is different about me. Everything. Not one thing has stayed the same. But, well, I'm still Bernardo Kastrup. So from the point of view of Bernardo Kastrup, there is a flow of time. But Bernardo Kastrup didn't stay the same. This thing we call Bernardo Kastrup changed with it. So if the reference point is changing with the changes around it, then you're just going over the track on the CD. The head follows the track on the CD. Is the CD changing? No. You're just scanning it with a reference point that moves along with the changes on the CD. But we think we are not moving, and then the CD rotates.
Now we're getting somewhere.
But this relates to the question of whether you move through time or time moves through you, doesn't it? Is it not the same?
I think it's deeper, because there is another point he made, which is not original from him, but he used it very effectively, which is the following. Suppose we could time travel. Suppose I could now go back to when we woke up today. If I truly time travel, then I would not have the memories of our conversation right now, because that was not part of the state of nature when we woke up this morning. In other words, we could be time traveling every blank time, and we would be completely clueless about it, because every time you jump to a certain point in time, your memories would be consistent with that state. So if you jump to the future, the moment you arrive, you will have the memories of the intervening period between now and the future. If you jump to the past, you will lose the memories of the intervening period between now and the past. So what he's saying is that there is no passage of time, because at every point in the static structure of time, the states that constitute your memory are consistent with that point. And you will think time is passing because some of those states will correspond to this part of the structure of time. And you construe that as memories of the past. And then you jump to the next point and you think, oh, something else in between has happened. But no, when you are in this point, just as you are here, you could have gone there, and you would still have the feeling that time is flowing linearly and consequentially. And this is a crucial point. Which is not original by Paul Davies.
I know it has absolutely nothing to do with it, but it does remind me, in discussing with Marcus Müller-Boltzmann brains.
It's the same kind of mind-bending.
Mind-boggling. I know it is a different... Okay.
But I think the crucial point, though, is that Paul is arguing that the experience of consciousness, however you interpret it, this passage of time, he thinks that will never be part of physics. But at least that's what he said. He was open to a broader physics, but at least with his present perspective of physics, he thinks that that cannot possibly contain it. So he thinks this is in the domain of neuroscience and psychology, but not in the domain of physics. And that was where I was sort of disagreeing with him.
Yeah, check. He does not account for qualia or for sort of the I that then experienced that point, right? It's just giving you the structure and how this could work.
I think the flaw Paul makes there is by saying what he's saying, that this should be a matter for neuroscience. The hidden assumption, he has a lot of hidden assumptions. We can talk more about it when we discuss Julia's presentation. But the hidden assumption he's making is that you can reduce consciousness. Because if you can reduce consciousness, then in that reduction process, consciousness doesn't survive all the way down to physics. So you need to study how consciousness then emerges, and therefore it's an issue for neuroscience. The problem is, neuroscience is not reducing consciousness. It has made exactly zero progress since it started trying. So Paul is being too optimistic here. If consciousness is not reducible, then it's part of physics, because that's the only place where the primitives can be found. It's in foundations of physics. That's why it's called foundations of physics. So his assumption there is that consciousness is reducible, and that's too optimistic an assumption.
Presentation given by Julia Mossbridge, and how do precognition and other perceptual anomalies shed light on models of consciousness, unconsciousness, and time. And this was very much about edge science, right? We already discussed it.
She was explicitly talking as a parapsychologist, and she has it even in her title. Well, she talks about precognition, which is parapsychology. So, and I was very pleased. I wanted to have at least one person who was going to push parapsychology or premonition. So, and I thought she fulfilled that role very well. Of course, in the end, Alex also pushed for parapsychology. It was an interesting presentation because she also has a very nice style of presenting, very sort of laid back. But she didn't. The interesting thing was she didn't really present the evidence, which is fair enough because, I mean, she's written books about it and there wasn't really time to do that. And so she was more interested, I think, in the models for precognition and the sort of implications. And I found it, I thought I liked the way she quoted Jessica Utts, the story about how Jessica, who was the president of the American Statistical Association, really, one of the top statisticians, basically said there is proper evidence for this phenomenon. If the evidence for a drug company was as strong as this, they would market the drug because and that was really, for the subject, that was really quite a boost because she was a very prestigious person within statistics. So she told that story, but apart from that, she didn't talk about the evidence. But of course, well, I'm aware of the evidence, so I didn't need that. But in terms of her, what she said, she talked about different types of precognition. And she talked about, I think, what she called direct and indirect.
Oh, that's it,
And that's a little bit, maybe a little bit technical, but in direct precognition, it's a matter of you can foresee your future brain state. Okay, so you will only precognize something you're going to see, like when you read the newspaper report. In indirect precognition, it's a much bigger idea where you've got general access. You know, it's not a direct arrow from future to present. It's sort of an arrow which is wriggling around. That's a little bit harder to picture, and I'm not quite sure which. I resonated mostly with the first picture because that she refers to time slips, which I like because it sort of relates to my idea of an expanded specious present. The second view, the indirect one, was a little bit trickier to model, but it's all related to this question. A lot of the discussion later focused on whether you can change the future. If you see the future, can you change it? And if you change it, it wasn't a precognition and things like that. So I suppose what was also noticeable, she got into a debate with Paul, which was a little bit interesting, but maybe wasn't altogether satisfactory, where Paul said, well, if precognition is real, how come there aren't all these people making billions on the stock market? And her reply was not very convincing. I think her reply was, well, maybe they are using precognition. And
Yeah, and
I know
they
Bernardo
will never
feels
tell
strongly
you
about
because
this,
they don't.
but
Yeah.
because I wasn't very convinced. In fact, she might have said that people have done experiments. I remember there was someone called Douglas Dean, and he actually did experiment using precognition to make money on the stock market. But I mean, there are other reasons. I know Bernardo's got a reason which he will probably elaborate on. So that to me was actually quite because I'm familiar with most of Julia's ideas. So that little debate about the why people haven't made billions out of precognition, I found quite interesting, actually. I mean, it might have been handled better, but I found it an interesting debate because...
Yeah, and before we move on, Bernardo, to your point, you wanted to reflect on Paul Davies' critic to Julia Mossbridge's presentation. I did think your model could account for, she started off with this image which I really liked, where we see sort of, say, the block universe, but then very simplified in a timeline from 9/11 to Corona, COVID. And she started in one image, and then she showed us how we sort of move through the block universe, and then people who have precognition, that sort of our simplified model, have the overview, right? And then you can say, oh, there's COVID, and you see the whole picture.
That's the picture, like the tabletop is all the space.
Exactly. So, and it seems to me that your model can account for that, right? She says if a future is there, we should be able to get information from it. So that would be sort of in this fifth dimension, you can access future information?
Yes. I mean, actually, it made me think about my model, because in my model, the idea is that all of space-time is in principle accessible from this fifth dimension.
Yeah.
You know, you can imagine going up, and the further up you go. Yeah. You might even think of this fifth dimension as a height. So the further up you go, the more you can see.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
You can there's even a model of the fifth dimension, which a guy called Jordan has, where he claims that during a near-death experience, people have these strange experiences of time. And his model is that actually you're moving in a fifth dimension, and how high you go determines what sort of phenomena you have. But in some sense, when you go high enough, the idea is that when you're locked into a brain, you're locked into this particular point in the fifth dimension. But when you have an OBE, you escape the filter and you can sort of move up. And you can imagine that the higher you go, the more you can see of this landscape, of this four-dimensional landscape.
Yeah.
And so that's the sort of model of precognition, in which how far you can see is a function of how far you go. But there's also this model that you have a specious present, which is not the same model exactly. So, and in fact, I associate the specious present with an extra dimension. So I myself am not clear. I mean, it's not as... She had this rather amusing phrase where she said there are all these different theories of consciousness, which are like toothbrushes. I quite like that. I mean, obviously a bit disparaging, but I mean, it's fair enough, because I myself, it's not like I know.
Everyone has one, and nobody wants to use the other.
That's a nice point of the analogy. You don't want to use anyone else's, but I mean, so
only if you've haven't brushed your teeth for like a week, maybe.
Yeah. But you can see that there's two. Even in my description, there are two models of precognition. One in which it's a specious present squelching out. Yeah. Because within the specious present, past and future are indistinguishable, and another in which you shine a spotlight from high. So they're just two different metaphors, both of which in some sense are associated with my model. So my own model is somewhat confused, I would say. I mean, I don't quite know what I favor, and so the fact that she had two models, direct and indirect, well, fair enough. That's her toothbrush.
Yeah, exactly. You use a toothbrush until it's finished, and you have a new one. Yeah.
She actually has two toothbrushes herself, so direct and indirect. Yeah.
And then Bernardo, of course, that point of critique by Paul Davies, that if people with precognition, why aren't they all billionaires, right? And the two of them had a debate, and you found Julia's response not so satisfying from philosophical.
I particularly like Julia and her work, and we share many views. So of course, I have the tendency to be more critical, because the stuff she's touching on is dear to me. So the audience should regard what I'm about to say as an expression of particular appreciation and respect for Julia. But I thought she missed an opportunity to to make her case better, because Paul's criticism was entirely valid. If precognition exists, then why aren't precognitives rich? Because even if precognition is weak and not fully reliable, if you are 1% above chance, statistically, you'll still be rich. You know, you just bet consequently on the stock market, and that 1% delta, will make a difference, maybe a significant difference over time, because it accrues over time.
Exponential.
Yeah. Or the roulette wheel. It doesn't have to be the stock market.
Anywhere, And she replied by saying, well, maybe they are, and they are just not telling you that they are precognitive. Maybe the rich people around are precognitive, but they have no interest in telling you that, because they can get more benefit by staying quiet about it. I thought that was a missed opportunity, because Paul's question, the logical structure of his question, was fallacious. And I don't mean this disrespectfully, I mean this technically. I think he was entirely not malicious in the way he argued the question, but this is the kind of thing that analytic philosophers tend to pick and split hairs about. The logical structure of Paul's criticism is the following. If precognition exists, then all classes of events are precognizable. That's fallacious. An existence argument is based on this logical structure. If precognition exists, then at least one class of event is precognizable, not necessarily all. You see? But by replying the way she did, Julia implicitly acknowledged the logical structure of Paul's question. And Paul did, at least emotionally, implicitly, understand it that way, because he said, now I'm even more skeptical, because his logical structure now was validated by the opponent. The one person who had the biggest intrinsic interest in defeating that logical structure, and she didn't. You see?
But you can be more precise, because you're arguing from our previous conversation that the events which are precognizable are the ones which have some strong emotional.
Yes, if you look at the evidence for precognition, one of the experiments that I found personally most compelling was the experiment of computers randomly choosing a photo to display to somebody sitting behind the computer, or in front of the computer in English. We say behind the computer in Dutch. And the person is instrumented with electrodes to sense spikes in emotional activity, like skin conductivity, maybe even the EEG cap, depending on the particular experiment, the particular protocol. But the idea is the following. When you have an emotional response to something, these electrodes can pick it up. And their time resolution is pretty good. They can figure out exactly when you had that emotional response. And then a computer randomly picks a picture, and that picture can be a neutral picture. Flowers in a field, a building, two people kissing gently, or it can be an emotionally evocative picture, hardcore porn, or explicit violence, people blown to bits, things like this, things that you look and you go, that you say, I wish I could unsee that. And it turns out that people respond emotionally to the hard pictures before the computer selects them. And when the computer selects a normal picture, then you don't see that level of emotional reaction. So people are at a level that is not metacognitively accessible. You can't access it through introspection. People are reacting to a future event before the event. But what this shows is two things. One, precognition exists because there is at least one class of event that is precognizable, and that's emotionally evocative events. But it shows a second thing. Things that are not emotionally evocable do not trigger at least that particular kind of precognition. Now, do you think a movement in the stock market index qualifies as emotionally evocative, like a picture of somebody blown to bits? You see?
Yeah.
But there's another point, Bernardo, though, because I have to say I myself have had precognitive dreams. I record them in a diary, at least which I think might be precognitive. But they're not necessarily emotional things, but and sometimes they're very trivial things. But what's striking is that they're very anomalous, because they're unusual.
Yeah.
I mean, like, for example, I once had a dream, and in the dream there was this cat, okay, and this cat was swallowing this tennis ball. I'm joking, and I thought this is really, and I woke up, you know, really shocked by this. It woke me up. The next step, because I don't have a cat, like Bernardo, don't even have a tennis ball. But anyway, the next morning I opened the newspaper, and there was a picture of a catfish with a ball in its mouth.
A catfish with whiskers.
But the point about that was that it was a trivial event, and it wasn't emotional, but it was striking.
So it was evocative in some sense.
It was evocative, yes. All I'm saying is the word emotion may not be, it's not just emotion, it's something which in some sense is striking.
But if the NASDAQ index goes up by 1% tomorrow, I don't think that will qualify as this either.
Not for me, it might for some people, I don't know, but it certainly wouldn't get me excited. But it's, I mean...
But I like that research you're referring to, because that is sort of hard evidence that it exists. Because I interviewed just Jeffrey Kripal, who you both know, and he makes sort of the analogy of saying it's like you're in search of zebras on the North Pole. You try to, in lab settings, try to prove stuff that you know exists, but not on the North Pole. You'll never find it there. And that's the difficulty with these phenomena, but it seems to close down our whole conversation and the whole wrap-up of this beautiful conference. Can
I just follow up one point about the billionaire? Because I think it's interesting. I make a prediction that mainstream science or mainstream society will not have accepted precognition or any of these psychic phenomena until they have some commercial value, until you can make some invention which people, like the psychic light bulb or light switch or whatever, which people can exploit and make money out of. And in fact, I will predict that if psi is real, at some stage someone's going to become a billionaire through using it, not necessarily through the stock market, but simply by marketing some psychic device. So maybe the reference to billionaires is not entirely a red herring.
There's another, if I may, also a quick follow-up point, because it's on the same vein of what I was discussing. Another point Julia made, I also thought sold her own position a little bit too short, which is when she was discussing these two types of precognition, direct and indirect, I think she used the terms. In the direct case, your future self has direct access to the information. So your present self is accessing its own future cognitive states.
Yeah, she said Mozart hearing his future symphony.
His future symphony. Yeah. And in the indirect case, you are accessing a future state, but not necessarily one that your future self will directly access. But then she formulated these two hypotheses in the form of, in the direct case, information within the light cone, and the indirect case, information outside the light cone. So what's the light cone? The light cone is, if there is an event happening at a certain distance from you, information about that event can only come to you at most at the speed of light in a vacuum. If the event is further away than that, then you cannot receive information in time about that event. So events that are further away than that key distance are outside the light cone. And events that are within the light cone are such that you can receive information about those events within speed of light constraints. But the direct precognition does not require that information be fundamentally inaccessible, in other words, outside the light cone. It only requires that your future self cannot access it, even if the information is within the light cone. Like if an information is locked up in a safe and you do not have the key or the code, then that information is well within the light cone. It's on the other side of the safe. But your future self can't access it. You know what I mean? So she made a much more severe, fundamental distinction that is not necessary.
It's not even needed.
Because the implication of the way she formulated it is that if it's within the light cone, then it's precognizable. No!
No, it needs to be accessible. Also.
I was interested, you mentioned Mozart. Well, actually, I think I asked the question about Mozart. And the point was this, and I've always been intrigued by this, that Mozart, his symphonies would come into his head.
Yeah.
But if you believe in precognition, this applies to anyone, you don't have to be Mozart. If you believe in precognition, you should be able to see your future work, be it a poem or a piece of music.
Because it's your own work.
Because it's your own. And therefore, within this direct precognition, and therefore, the question is, you think you're creating this, but actually you're hearing yourself, you're plagiarizing yourself in the future.
Yeah.
And so the question is that telling you something subtle about the nature of creativity and genius, that in some sense, creativity by its very nature has to involve some sort of closed time-like loop?
Some kind of Ouroboros.
A sort of Ouroboros, but I mean, in a way that could be used as an argument to say that you don't believe in precognition because you get into this paradox. On the other hand, Mozart did claim he heard his music. And so maybe the reason I have a brilliant idea, maybe I have this idea about higher dimensions explaining mind, maybe the reason is because I've written this paper in the future and I saw it when I was 15.
Retrocausality is discussed in physics. I mean, it's strange, but it's not something...
It's in the quantum realm, yeah.
Yeah, that's Wheeler. We have to. I loved. There were a couple of times it was mentioned, right? Sort of the interpretation of the delayed choice experiment and how applicable it is on a larger scale.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that Wheeler himself, I mean, the whole participatory universe, and he struggled his whole life with the U he drew, right? Sort of the Big Bang and the observer, sort of bringing into existence. I'm quoting, unquoting. And how did? I mean, I'm puzzled here, but how does that relate to all of this? Because then we have retrocausality. Can we change our past?
Well, this is the point, you see, that Paul Davies made, that it isn't changing the past.
Yeah.
The point is the past.
You got to hear
it. You can't change the past until it's been formed, and it isn't formed till you look. So with that picture of the universe, with the eye forming a closed circuit, the point is, in this picture, the universe doesn't properly exist until the eye has looked back on the universe. Now, not many physicists will believe that. They will think it's too metaphysical. But it is, in some sense, an implication of the view that consciousness collapses the wave function. Yeah. But then you get into the question of, well, what is the consciousness collapsing the wave function? Because the critics will say, well, look, I can see the universe. I'm looking with my the James Webb Space Telescope, and I'm seeing things in the universe before any human beings, and possibly before any alien beings are ever formed. So how is this possible if there was no consciousness? In other words, how could the universe have existed before there were any observers? But the counter-argument is you've got to decide what you mean by consciousness, because consciousness with a little c may not have existed, but what about consciousness with a big C?
Exactly.
If mind was primary.
Yeah.
So
the idea of consistent histories, which is what we are talking about, it's not as weird as it sounds. And like Bernardo was explaining, even if we know history only at a very coarse level. Characters, events. We don't know the positions and trajectories of every elementary subatomic particle corresponding to those macro events. So there are many possible histories of those paths that are consistent with what we do know. Yeah. So you can imagine that a consistent history is what you get when you take a magnifying glass and you look at the past with a microscope. And then those various possibilities that are consistent with the past at a coarse level, which you do know, they will collapse into one of them.
One of those paths.
Because you looked with a microscope into them.
And you're not changing that instantly something else because you change your past now.
This is not any more crazy than the measurement problem in the present already is. Yeah. It's no more crazy than that. Yeah. It may be crazy, but it's no more crazy than the one that we have in the present. How does an observation produce one single result if all we have is the laws of large numbers and Schrodinger's equation?
Yeah.
I've often thought that even the distinction between quantum and classical might be observant dependent, because in fact a feature of specious present even, because the quantum classically an electron goes around a proton, but in quantum mechanics the electron doesn't go around the proton, it's actually a wave around the proton.
Yeah.
And that's rather reminiscent. Do you remember in my talk I showed this light going round and how it goes round too fast, and it sort of is basically a line. Well, this is rather like this proton, which instead of being a point going around is a circle. And so I've often thought, well, maybe the division between quantum and classical is something to do with the specious presence of the observer. And if that was the case, for a being with a much longer specious present, then a much larger domain of the world would appear to be quantum. Okay, because it's got a longer time scale. On the other hand, with a being with a much smaller specious presence, a lot of the quantum world would appear classical.
Yeah.
Again, this isn't mainstream physics, but it's often struck me there might be a link between, because that's a big issue in physics. What is the divide between the quantum?
Yeah, where does it stop?
And the classical realm? And George Ellis made a big thing about that. So we don't really know, because the point is that it's nice to say quantum mysteries just apply in the microscopic domain, but it's not as simple as that. We do know they propagate into the macroscopic domain, possibly brains, but certainly in biological systems. So the idea that in some sense what is quantum and what is classical depends upon the nature of the observer, it doesn't sound to me completely crazy.
Very interesting. Gentlemen, it's been a very nice looking back on this beautiful conference. Is there a closing remark you would like to make? The people watching, you guys can watch all of the presentations we've been talking about. The links will be below here. We will be publishing them individually. Bernard, are you looking back? Are you happy having hosted this conference?
I'm most happy because it's brought together a lot of my friends, but not just friends, people who've got such interesting thoughts on these sorts of issues. Not all of them agreeing, but that makes, to me,
that's so
more
beautiful,
interesting.
I think.
If everyone agreed, it would be a bit boring. It's quite nice having people with different views. Of course, we haven't answered all the questions. But I think that, it was Paul who talked about the muddlescape, and of course, everyone's muddled about these problems because we've been puzzling about them for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Whether we're
Perhaps
philosophers,
it got more muddled
whether we're philosophers or whether we're physicists, we're muddled. And in some sense, the more you learn, the more you get muddled. You just get muddled about different things. However, I do think that it was a very helpful meeting. I do think somehow we're less muddled, and at least what's useful is that we at least realize we were muddled.
Yeah, at least that. That's already an enormous step.
Nice,
and that's progress.
Yeah.
And I don't know which theory is correct. Obviously I push my own theory, but that may be wrong. Everybody has their own theory. In the end, it doesn't really matter to me which theory is right or wrong, because most theories will probably turn out to be wrong in the end. What's really interesting is the debate.
Exactly.
And the exchanges. And I think from that point of view, it was a very good meeting. I'm very grateful, obviously, to the Essentia Foundation and in particular to Bernardo, but because it gave us the opportunity to have the meeting.
Yeah, we are very grateful that you did this, and very beautiful to see how you hosted it. It was very respectful of all different perspectives and very asking the right questions on the right moment. Very good timekeeping.
A true BBC presenter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's amazing to see. Bernardo, do you have any closing remarks?
I loved the conference, not least because it was a wonderful excuse to force Bernard to come here again after 4 years.
Yeah.
The only sad thing, I can't use this excuse again next year, so I have to come up with something else to put him on a plane and fly him over here.
Well, another 4 years perhaps. Yeah.
To me, just as a sort of closing remark, to me is to see how sort of these different disciplines inform each other and how important it is, sort of the divide between physics and philosophy, and the two perhaps not discussing as much or interacting as much as they should. I mean, that to me, if you look back at the history of science, the birth of quantum theory, to me, from a sort of lay perspective, is so super interesting because philosophy was involved and those physicists were very much into philosophy. And I think progress in science needs that debate. So I think we did that, right? And that's thanks to the two of you. So
well, at the boundaries of physics, you're all at the forefronts of physics. You're always on the boundary with philosophy, I would say.
Yeah. Because
you've got the theory, but you don't just have the data, and that's why I think it is so important to have these different fields intersecting, and that's why in my introduction I stressed the fact that consciousness brings together all these different academic disciplines, and that's both challenging and rewarding.
Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. You can watch all presentations and please continue the discussion with us in the comments below. Like and subscribe and help us continue making content like this. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you, Bernard. Very nice.
Thank you, Hans, for all the work you've done.
No thanks. I've enjoyed it.